Okay, thanks for the invitation, and yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, you have, right now in the lab, we're working a lot on embodied cognition and prosody and gesture interaction, but I've been asked to do something that I really have liked to do, which is assess a project that I was running for around 10 years, the Romance Prosody project, and you know, we can extract some lessons from it, and I think it's a nice place to assess, you know, the things that were going on and how they can serve for future cross-linguistic projects. So, just a small roadmap on the things I want to say. First, just explain briefly the Romance Prosody project, then talk a little bit about the common tools that we use, the common elicitation method, and a common, almost common prosodic transcription method, which I'll talk about a little bit. And the main lessons that I think that can be extracted from it is, first one, I really think that we need to work more and more towards having a common transcription tool, not only intonational but also prosodic. So I'll talk a little bit about this. Also, we saw that there were lots of meanings converging in one, for example, in one intonational contour, and you know, realizing that there is this multidimensionality, I think is important for how we extract data. Also, the interaction that when we realize the strong pragmatic interaction between prosody and gesture, not only the temporal interaction. Also, we realized by comparing different Romance languages how different languages really use different means to express the same thing. Like, you know, in some languages we will see some experiment on this. They are using more pragmatic particles, and others more intonation. It's like a compensatory effect that you find. And then, I think this has been said before, prosody, of course, involves not just intonation, and it has you know, a lot of focus on intonation, but there are so many things else, like that are affecting meaning, and it's so clear. And just finish with some thoughts and reflection. So, okay, so just talk a little bit about the project. This part does not have the Brazilian, well, the Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, which was also included, and also South America, Central, and Mexico. What we did was a total of 9 languages with their dialects. This was a coverage that took many of the dialects in these languages, and overall I think we're like 70 or 80 people working on the project, because says even with just French, we had like 5-6 teams working on different dialects. So that's, but it worked quite well, I think. I'm going to concentrate mainly on the intonation survey, because we basically had, for each location, we had an intonation survey. The goal was to collect, to try to look at intonational grammar and what the variation in intonation that associates to pragmatic meaning differences. So that's what we were trying with the to do with the intonation survey. And then we also collected mock task and video interviews, but we didn't analyze those. Okay, so the first goal was to establish cross-linguistic comparisons on the prosody of these 9 Romance languages and their dialects. And up to the start of the project, we couldn't do that because there was no common methodology that was used. So it was basically comparisons of small studies here and there, talking about, okay, how do we do incredulity questions? How do we do, right? So that was a way to really say, okay, let's try to have the same methodology, and then we're able to compare, at least to have a small framework on intonational grammars on these languages. The main interest, at least from some of us, was to assess what is the mapping between prosody and meaning. So variations in prosody in these different languages, what pragmatic meaning differences do they trigger, right? That was one of the main interests. And crucially, we adopted the same data elicitation method and the same transcription method, or quite the same transcription transcription method. Let's briefly talk about what we use, which is the oral discourse completion task, and I want to advocate a little bit for this in here. This is a elicitation method. I've been working on it for the last 20, 25 years in this project, but also in other projects. It's used in intercultural pragmatics a lot, and also in clinical and non-clinical assessment of pragmatic development, for example, in tools like SCASL. And they work quite well, right? In general, you can obtain, you can basically see how the participants are getting to the situation and respond like if they were in the situation. It has been criticized, of course, but I would say that after the experience of using it, it's quite rewarding. The thing is that, well, you probably know how it works right here. I don't know if you are able to see it. We have a situation that we control quite well in the description of the context, and there you can control, for example, who you're talking to, if you want to look for politeness issues, right? In this case, we were basically setting up a situation that would lead to a uncertainty statement, right? And it worked quite well. You could really tell that the output was, okay, I'm not sure about this. Crucially, this was a free response, because we really wanted to see also how intonation interacts with other modules in grammar, right? So in general, our assessment of the oral discourse completion task is quite good. So participant responses were quite natural. Across ages, we worked with also with people, like you were talking about this before, people that did not have reading abilities in their language. In Occitan is basically oral language in that area, and they were quite comfortable with the oral discourse completion task. Then a crucial thing that you can do with the DCT is basically control for the socio-pragmatic features of the prompts. So this allows you to really study effects, specific effects that you want to look for. And also having a non-scripted response allowed us to assess potential interactions between prosody and use other modules of grammar. So that's also how we studied a little bit this, right? Okay, then the second common tool was used the prosodic transcription tool based on the AM Toby framework, but of course, we had to deal with a variety of Toby, you know, right, of Toby proposals for different languages, which were a bit different already, right? So after some meetings, right, we kind of try to converge, or I cannot say that we use the pan-Romance system, right, because there are differences, but we quite got to a point of convergence, and this made us realize of the need that we, even within our languages, that we needed something more standard. But of course, we couldn't agree on leaving up some of the traditional, you know, just symbols that each Toby had, and so it was not complete. But we quite got to a near stage, right? So I would say that we developed a quasi-prosodic standard for Romance Toby, but not there. That's why I'm convinced that we really need to get a standard, right? I've seen before the use, for example, of a mid boundary tone, right? In many other Tobys, the downstep high is used with the same equivalent meaning, right? Why are we using two symbols, sometimes even three, right, for the same thing? So that's, we need this. Okay, the project in a way ended in the publication of the book Intonation in Romance, published by OUP. And basically there, each team presents the results of the analysis of the intonation survey in 9 different languages and dialects by using this a standard transcription. And it's quite nice because you can see uncertainty statements, for example, elicited in the same way. How are they realized in and different places. And this allows us to have a start with an intonational grammar of the different languages. So it was quite a nice exercise. It also made us realize of the strong interaction between intonation and other grammatical tools, and we're going to talk a little bit about these. So now I'm going to concentrate a little bit on the lessons and insights that we can extract from this project that can perhaps serve other cross-linguistic projects in the future. And then we can explore a little bit about this. Okay, first, again, right, the need of a common transcription tool. I'll stress this over and over because I think that it's crucial to have transparent comparisons, right? What happens right now still in the book, right, is that the TOBI systems that are in there represent a compromise between broad phonetic analysis and phonological level of transcription. You know that TOBI really, the only thing you can do with TOBI is phonologically labeled, right? You're not supposed to do broad phonetic transcription. But we're not doing this in reality in many TOBI systems. For example, in all Romance TOBI systems, we use downstep high star accents, but they are not phonologically distinct. Also, in Spanish TOBI and other TOBIs, we mark that a peak is misplaced and put in the next syllable. But this is not contrastive with not having it, right? And again, I mean, we would find more and more cases of the non-systematicity of being, really always at the phonological level and not at the broad phonetic level. So what we did was to present, and I'll just quickly summarize the EPRA proposal that several people have put forward, which is basically try to make a step forward in the way of trying to find, to propose some standard based on the AM system. We think it's important to have two levels of transcription that could clarify the use of the mixture that right now is being used in the different TOBIs. And we think that we need an international set of labels that we all agree on, right? Not having mid and downstep high, for example, right? Or there are many, because say I start with a new language, depending on the TOBI I base myself in, I'm going to adopt many features that are not going to be used in other languages. So if we had an agreement of a pool of labels, then that would be quite easy and more transparent, right? So I just want to put briefly a clear case of what I think it's an important argument for having a broad level of transcription to clarify the transcription levels. And this is the case of truncated contours. This is quite common across languages that you have, for example, a low plus high star low contour that when you are in final, this is located in word with final stress, and it's at the end of the sentence, it's truncated. So you basically don't realize the fall, right? What do people do here? Do they really transcribe as TOBI is really saying low plus high star low in both cases? Not really. What we do is to transcribe the high boundary count because we want to really reflect what is happening, right? So the proposal is to really have, okay, let's have a phonological, target, which is the actual intonation, and then let's transcribe what is happening to the contour, for example, when it's truncated. So that's, I think it's, I just put this because Megan has worked on this type of truncation for Puerto Rican Spanish, so you can have, but there are many other languages that have similar situation. So I think that both levels of transcriptions are needed. So some advantages of having an EPRA tool, whatever it is, that I think that we need, it's let's clarify the level of transcription we're at. Let's facilitate transparent analysis of tunes across languages. We will improve by doing this inter-transcriber agreement. We have done inter-transcriber agreement for Catalan, for example. And what happens is that we always have problems, of course, with downstep, with low plus high star, Some people transcribe it at the phonological level, or others more at the broad phonetic level. So it's to facilitate the study of languages in contact and L2 prosody. That what are you doing when you do L2 prosody and or languages in contact? Which TOBI are you using, right? You cannot start with a clear TOBI there. And also to facilitate automatic and semi-automatic labeling of large corpora. So that's a lesson that we had from our cross-linguistic project, because even when we try to do this, you are not completely sure, if you take, for example, Portuguese and Catalan, that the same, I'm thinking of a specific contour, that we're really comparing the same things. I know how the contour is, but the transcription of it does not really match what I would do if I had to, write the contour from the labels. Okay, so that's the first lesson. Another lesson is that the realization that we are working with multidimensional levels of intonational meaning, right? We tend to focus on things that say, okay, let's, there is focused intonation, right? Low pass, high start, low. But on top of focused intonation, we have, for example, epistemic meanings and politeness meanings, right? And we have layers, identity, sociolinguistic meanings, right? So it's, that's what we realized and what we did not take into consideration in writing the prompts for the discourse completion task. So that's, I'm going to just show an example of, okay, we had this elicitation bit eliciting corrective focus, and since we knew that we had a contradiction tune, we elicited this contradiction tune, which is corrective focus plus disagreement, by using another context. But this is also corrective focus. The only difference is that you express disagreement or strong disagreement with the person you're talking to. So here we already have two layers of pragmatic meaning that if we had realized this before, we should have constructed our materials taking into account all these interactions, all these integration of different meanings that contours express. So, for example, in our elicitation materials, we don't have, for example, the interaction between information structure, epistemic management, and politeness. We don't have that. And as well as many other combinations that would lead to different prosodies. But we did this through separate experiments and more controlled experiments. So that's what we did basically, right? We have more focused experiments. For example, we wanted, once we realized that different, for example, interrogative contours could integrate epistemic meanings, we designed an experiment, which is the one that is just being published in NNLT, right? What we organized in there were discourse completion tasks, but really controlling for epistemic meanings. In this case, epistemic meanings related to agreement with your interlocutor, or a commitment to what you are saying. It's you get very different contours depending on how you control for these epistemic meanings. So that's what we did basically. I briefly will explain the experiment. Our hypothesis was whether question intonation contours in Catalan encoded epistemic operators these two, basically different degrees of a speaker commitment on the content of the proposition, and also different degrees of a speaker agreement. Basically, here we're talking about what people have described as certainty questions or confirmatory questions, right? If you are committed to what you are asking, you already have a hypothesis about what you are asking, your intonation is going to be, the prosody in some cases is going to be different. And the same with agreement. If I've asked you with incredulity, I'm going to have a different, in some cases, a completely different pitch contour. Okay, so what we did was to design our elicitation materials by controlling whether the degree of speaker commitment was low, mid, or high, and whether the degree of speaker agreement was high, mid, or low. Okay? So, and then we basically ran an acceptability rating experiment to see the match between the context and the actual intonation, to see how accepted was this by the speaker. Okay, the procedure was to have online the 151 Central Catalan speakers, and we had an acceptability rating task with the actual context controlling very precisely by this, for these commitment factors, and then the participant had to rate how acceptable it was to have this intonation in this context. Okay, so what we found was that if you look at here, degrees of speaker commitment, first you have all these 4 different nuclear pitch contours. These are basically the main interrogative contours in Catalan. So low star high, La Maria, the other high plus low star, La Maria, right? The other one is like the circumflex, La Maria, and then the other one is like the rising, falling, rise, La Maria, right? Okay, so these were matched to the context, and what happens is that, okay, these two basically have low preference. They were not accepted in any of the commitment contexts, and these two were preferred, right? The rising one was basically for low commitment, and the falling one was for higher commitment. So if I'm asking and I already have a hypothesis, I will tend to use the falling question, even though in grammars it's considered to be equivalent, right? In Catalan grammars. And if I'm not so committed, I would use the low star high. Well, same thing if you look at speaker agreement. This contour has low preference, but in general, you can say that low agreement with low star high and high agreement, these two were quite similar with basically the circumflex contours. So what we see here, it's basically that question intonation contours encode preferences in a speaker commitment and speaker agreement. So we're talking about 2 different layers of meaning, and that a speech act in this case and epistemic information are simultaneously encoded in one intonation contour. But there you can keep adding layers. That's the thing. That's our hypothesis. So our hypothesis right now, we would like to try to test this hypothesis by looking at previous studies and also doing more studies, is that prosodic patterns simultaneously and probably obligatorily encode several layers of sociopragmatic meaning, and we can talk about all these meanings, right? A speech act management, information structure, affective management, politeness, epistemic stance, and like we were saying this morning, sociolinguistic stance or identity. All of it is included there. So if we want to describe it, at least we have to be aware of how complex it can be, right? So it's perhaps talking about focus intonation, it's too simplistic, right? Because we always have more information. So that's a hypothesis that I'd like to put forward. And then of course, when you add your layer of gesture, is like you add a lot of information also related to all these multidimensional meanings. And that's the idea. We know that gesture and speech are integrated both from a phonological and semantic point of view, but there is a really strong, and that's what we learned also in the last 10 years, the strong parallelism is not only between prosody and between gesture and speech, but between prosody and gesture. So a lot of pragmatic meanings expressed in intonation and in prosody are expressed in the same way in gesture. You have parallels, and very, very strong parallels. The thing is that in the experiments that we have run lately, it's gesture seems to be stronger and more. You have more articulators to express meaning, and it can be perceived in a stronger way. So that's the idea, to put together gesture and prosody and analyze these meanings that occur simultaneously. Okay, just very briefly about how, yeah, if you would just, here I would like to just put this sentence, which is basically an echo question, right? And then you can see, try to see how it's produced in gesture and how it clarifies a lot of layers in meaning too. So it's basically that would be, oh, now it's not working. It was working before. Well, I can read it anyway. Quan m'havies dit que ha de néixer? Quan m'havies dit que ha de néixer? Perhaps with this, if I don't change a lot my voice quality or my speech rate or anything, you wouldn't guess what other meanings it can have, right? But if you look well at the face of the speaker and also her hands.
Quan m'havies dit que ha de néixer?
Okay, well, now it's a slow motion, and you see that here, first you see very clearly from the face that she's not so committed, so she's doubting a lot on what she says, not a neutral, high commitment question, or this is quite a strongly low commitment. And also you can see that by her face and everything and the movement of her hand that she probably has a quite a bit a negative stance, right? So we can see how gesture he's adding a lot of information about how to interpret the sentence, right? Then I want to briefly go over this because I only have 5 minutes. I think I had an experiment planned for this part, but we can go over it very quickly so I can run over the whole thing. We know that in romance, when you look at interrogative sentences, for example, or any sentence that you want to look at, there is many particles that are interacting with the intonation. So for example, I just put here some examples of interrogative particles that in many cases have even epistemic meanings, like for example the Sardinian a, right? So it's nice to have a tool that has a free response, right? Because otherwise you will not get these, or even changes in word order or all these, right? So it's, unless you know very well the variety and you know what the actual target is, I would tend not to use a scripting, right? So what we did is that, okay, we know that sentence initial and sentence final particles encode speech act and epistemic information with parallels that of intonation, and we wanted to see through an experiment if there was a compensatory distribution in the use of pragmatic particles and intonation. And we did, I can run briefly through the experiment. We compared Catalan versus Friulian, which are probably the two most extreme languages in the Romance world, which is, Catalan uses a lot of intonation contours for distinguishing epistemic meanings, and Friulian uses a lot of modal particles, pragmatic particles, for doing the same thing. So we basically had, discourse completion task experiment controlling also for commitment, and in this one was adding commitment operators to statements, not questions. So the question was that the presence of a rich system of epistemic pragmatic markers like Friulian entails fewer intonational epistemic contrasts, and the answer is yes, and it was done through a small experiment, okay? And basically, we had basically controlled very well in the trigger situation, the degree of commitment, high, mid, and low, and then we analyzed basically what the speakers responded, and analyzed the intonation and the appearance of pragmatic particles. And I'm going to briefly go over the results. In all the sentences, low commitment statements had a specific contour in Catalan. Potser no li agradarà. So it's something like, instead of being low, low, it's like low pass high star mid or something.
Potser no li agradarà.
Potser no li agradarà, instead of potser no li agradarà, which is more high commitment. And then very high commitment, which would be something like obviousness, then it's like low plus high star, low mid.
Home, doncs el seu company, en Jaume.
It's very low. Del seu company d'en Jaume would be like very exaggerated, right? Rising, falling, fall, rise. Friulian, on the other hand, is always the same focused constituent, so focused the nuclear configuration, which is high star plus low, low. Okay, it's always the same intonation.
Ma forse noi piacevi.
Okay, sounds very Italian. Yeah. And this one, same thing. Sorry.
Ma che domande sono? Io ho disarresti di toni, beh.
Okay, so it's the same rising, falling intonation in this position, right? So the big difference here is in the use of, if you look at the pragmatic markers, these specific pragmatic markers that Friulian uses are not used by Catalans, right? So you see there's a big difference in the use of pragmatic markers, and the same thing with commitment, with particles, specific pragmatic particles that Friulian uses are not used by Catalans. Okay, so let me just briefly explain the last two lessons, right, that we can obtain from the Romance project. This is basically the last thing, the last lesson that it's clear that we have lots of arguments for, right? I mean, duration has lots of effects, and intensity has lots of effects, voice quality has lots of effects. We have to include them in the analysis. I just had examples of vocatives, right? They are really, the duration patterns are really integrated. If you just describe vocatives by low plus high star mid, you really don't obtain the actual resulting pattern, right? Also, you know, how important it is, for example, to give directive information. Here I had two videos showing how the same sentence with the same intonation, if you speak it like very slowly, you get an exhortative effect, and with very fast, you get an imperative effect, and lots of arguments for these, right? So that's something that we have to take into account. So the general conclusions, it's one thing that I think we need to take into account is like this multidimensionality that we're not taking so much into account many times, and that these layers of meaning are really integrated and occur at the same time. So if we want to, in the end, discover what is the intonational grammar or the prosodic grammar of a language, we need to have all these well thought, and perhaps organize data elicitation methods that take all these into account. So otherwise we always miss certain intonations and certain prosodic patterns that are relevant from a semantic point of view. Then finally, the lessons on, just to repeat, right, we probably need to work more on common elicitation methods and transcription tools. We need to take into account all these simultaneous and interacting socio-pragmatic features that influence prosodic patterns. And I would tend to recommend to avoid scripting in general. We had one language that wanted to do both, and the scripting did not work so well, right? And then take into account, since if we don't use a script and use videos, we'll get the whole input for analysis, and we would be able to analyze the interactions between lexical, morphosyntactic, prosodic, and gestural features. And of course, just to repeat that pitch, duration, intensity, voice quality is very important. So just sorry for that. Oh yeah, I have these in case. I have a nice example of a project that would work like this. It's an international crosslinguistic project on the realization of politeness in prosody, and it's quite nice, so we can talk about it. Thank you.
so this talk is open for questions from students first. Students first. Well, since
Talk about the politeness project.
the students are a little shy, perhaps we'll open it up for general questions. Yes, there, please.
Yes. So you mentioned very briefly that you found in your study, in this study and others, that gesture is a stronger cue than spoken prosody. And I found that too in some of my work, but I was wondering if you could comment on why you think that's the case.
Why is yeah, I guess it have to comment on specific cases, but for example, the incredulity, we matched the incredulity phases with the intonations. That was the thesis of Juan here. And yeah, it was clear that actually the face, if you start furrowing your eyebrows and asking a question, even if it's a confirmatory question or a more neutral question, it immediately draws to, you are not agreeing, you are incredulous about what I just said, right? So it's really strong. It's really strong in general. Yeah, why is that? Yeah, visual inputs, right? It's impact.
Do you think visual information is like more impactful?
I don't know whether this is.
I was just wondering, because like I said, I found that too, but I mean, that's kind of the way I've gone, is just that it's more attention grabbing, and that's why it tends to be the superordinate cue, but I was just wondering if anybody else had better explanation.
Yeah, perhaps there's.
So, Kristen, you want to pick this up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just, so speaking as a field worker, I'm always struggling trying to find context where you observe gesture. In languages I work on are tonal, so I'm interested to see, is there something gestural that happens? But the context where I'm always looking at speakers are, they're in their kitchen cooking, they're outside working. People aren't looking at each other. And so I'm really curious about whether or not this effect is just because people are sitting in the lab, looking at somebody, staring at them as if we're just having coffee with someone, right?
I mean, there are cases where we
there's
do
a lot
it.
of, right, but
Yeah,
I'm just curious if, I mean, there's a lot of context where you
Sure.
might expect something completely different because people are busy, people are working, but they're still communicating.
Right.
And so are we generalizing this notion of the importance of gesture just on the basis of the context where we're always asking for people to examine or perceive speech?
Is that a question?
I mean, I guess like, it is a question. Yeah. I'm curious if it's an effect of the laboratory setting.
Well, you're saying that it's not so important, and
I always try to observe it, but it's hard when people's hands are full or they're not.
Well, I think that if you're in the metro just sitting and watching people, if they're face to face.
Sure.
Get a lot of information just from what they, how they move and what there is right.
Do you want to
Even
pick
if
this
you
up?
don't speak a language, right? You go abroad or something. It's you pay attention to all these
Sure.
cues, right? And
Sure.
it's you.
My only comment was people gesture when they're on the phone.
Yeah, I was thinking of that as well.
Yeah.
Stephanie, did you want to comment?
Well, there are a million things to go, but I just wanted your idea about the laboratory versus in the field was not specifically the laboratory, but just that people are not looking straight at it.
Right. It's the context of sort of everyday use where people might be working busy doing something else, and there's a lot of communication going on. People just aren't looking at each other.
They might be gesturing anyway for all
Right,
we know.
right,
Yeah,
that's
they
true.
can
I mean,
gesture with them.
Right.
What I was wondering is if people are different in the degree to which they respond more strongly to gesture than to spoken prosody. Do you
It
know?
could be. There are some studies on individual differences on theory of mind and prosodic attunement, and they seem to be correlated. I don't know about, probably since have the idea that prosody, pragmatic prosody and gestural prosody correlate so much that probably they are linked. And we just ran the study that we were talking about with children, and they are really correlated, right? Yeah. So we ran a study on gestural and prosodic imitation by 3-year-olds, and this correlates with pragmatic abilities measured independently from Castle. So it's, yeah, I don't know, but I think there's a need to do more on this, right? And the individual differences and yeah.
Christine?
So I like the kinds of things you can get with unscripted, free response that you're saying. I wonder if you have suggestions, like if you're, if people are trying to compress the focus and they're like, oh, I thought it was whatever, Mariana that made a marmalade, and want to say like, no, it was Marianne that made a marmalade or whatever. If you don't have it scripted, it makes me like, oh no. And so like if you're trying to look, I'm not saying necessarily, but you might not get a full sentence.
Well, you can
trying
look
to
at
get a particular syntactic structure or something. So I'm wondering if what your experiences with that are like, or do you have any
yeah, for
suggestions?
example, we have the example for contrastive focus, and of course you get some variation in the, but if you in general construct the scenario well, you can really get, but really being specific in the scenario, you can get quite a lot of common responses. And I would tend to like to risk this and have a little more variation than having a strict structure that then, this has happened so much in so many studies in Europe with German, with Spanish, with Catalan, and we've learned a lot from this. So, yeah. Even, I'm just thinking one example, which is, it's crazy, but they had a reading, they wanted to know what was the difference in the dialectal difference in interrogative intonation, and they just gave some sentence to read, and of course no particles, nothing. And we know that one of the dialects, I'm a speaker of this dialect, we add the target particle k almost every time we do certain questions, and of course no particle. And they were describing and said, come on, and this can happen, right? Yeah, this happens a lot.
Over here to the right. Yeah.
This was really great. I'm really excited to see, especially the discussion of the different types of meaning that really factor into intonation and the way that we need to think about beyond sort of surfacey types of meaning that we might start with. So I really appreciated that. I had a question about the finding that you had about the Friulian versus Catalan, which was that the Friulian sort of appeared not to use so much intonation to signal its meaning, but Catalan did. And I wonder if you're viewing that as sort of a necessary competition or just sort of something that falls out in some cases, or?
I wouldn't say it needs to be right. It happens to be like that in this case because we talked about it in the meetings with Paolo all the time. We were saying, well, you guys have all these intonations. We have just fixed intonation, which is narrow focus, but we use lots of particles, and we just trying to show this in a more, detailed way. And it tends to be, when you look at experiments done in other languages, it tends to be like that. Languages that use lots of particles use less intonation, right? But yeah.
So something that strikes me as relevant is perhaps Japanese has question markers, for example, but there are also intonational moves that you can make for certain questions, and they're sometimes in complementary distribution, but sometimes they're both together. And I suspect that the meanings that are contributed by each one are slightly different, not quite question, not question, but like you're saying, there's more articulated meaning in there. So I don't know if we'll work on that deeply, but I suspect that your approach would go really well.
And they can appear together, like there are lots of particles, like question particles in Romance that appear, in complementary, complementing intonation. So it's not. So we also almost ran an experiment with French, just saying, okay, when you have S, then you have low final lowering instead of having final rise. But it's yeah, we finally didn't do it because it's not clear that we have this functional, so there's lots of interactions. Yeah.
Continue on using someone in this comparative thing. Do you plan and do your data sort of, or your database, is it possible to do some more, continue the comparative study between the languages in some sort of systematic sense? So some sort of typology as a comparative. We go striking common relationship with the languages, like Romanian, is it more similar or similarity patterns? Is there an approach that allows for that? So how would you imagine using the material you have to?
You mean having a historical reconstruction?
Comparing which of these languages, let's say, you have there are sort of more similar to each other as opposed to which are sort of further apart.
There's a lot of variation, right? Even within Catalan, you find like extreme variations mostly in questions, and also in the way languages use intonations for specific meanings, like the contradiction. For example, tune that we have in some languages. In others, they would say, no, it doesn't sound familiar at all. I don't have so these are and I guess since contours are so different in themselves, it's hard to establish dialectal groups, because even within a language you find such strong differences. So I don't know, but it would be nice to be able to. Now what people are doing, the different groups, is running more specific experiments. Now that we have more like the baseline, that's
the vocabulary in terms of patterns among the Romance languages,
at least that's what we.
Calculate some frequency of the usage in particular context of these things, maybe.
Yeah. Even with French, because the French people were saying, well, French is completely different. You cannot use that, and well, we got to a point where we can share many things, and it's nice. But now talking about the future, I think I wanted to show this because I think it's a nice example of there are several groups working on how what is the prosody of politeness in requests, and the idea that there's a universal in prosody in politeness, and actually you find quite the same patterns in Korean, Catalan, English, and Japanese. And it's nice because you use similar methodologies, even though the situations are not the same. We describe a lot of phonetic patterns, and also we work with gestures, but not in the same papers. And it's nice because you're finding there a crosslinguistic tendency for what we call prosodic attenuation or prosodic mitigation. And it's nice because we're using similar tools to look for a potential universal prosodic pattern, which seems to be, okay, I mitigate my speech when I want to be polite, right? I lower the pitch instead of rising the pitch, like the frequency code would say, but that's common across many languages. So, suddenly if you have all this type of methodology, you can study many things across many different languages and look for a specific, realization, for example, of the incredulity phase. Is the incredulity phase universal, right? I mean, you can, using this very easy methodology, you can just get so much data.
I think we have to wrap this up. So let's thank our speaker.